2 days into their mission to the moon, an oxygen tank exploded inside the Apollo 13 spacecraft. 3 astronauts, roughly 200,000 miles from Earth, suddenly had no functioning way to get home. In the world we actually live in, all 3 men survived. But that outcome was never guaranteed. In fact, for several genuinely terrifying days in April 1970, it looked far more likely they wouldn't. Commander Jim Lovell radioed back the now famous words, "Houston, we've had a problem." What followed was one of the most extraordinary improvised survival efforts in human history. The explosion had crippled the main spacecraft's power and oxygen supply almost entirely. The crew's only option was to abandon most of the main capsule and cram into the lunar module, a tiny vessel designed to support 2 people for 2 days, now needing to support 3 people for 4. Carbon dioxide began building to dangerous levels almost immediately, because the lunar module's air filters weren't designed for 3 people breathing inside it. Mission control engineers on the ground had to invent a fix using only the exact materials the astronauts had on board. Working against the clock, they built a working prototype using plastic bags, cardboard, and duct tape, then radioed the instructions up to space, essentially teaching 3 exhausted astronauts to build a life-saving device out of spare parts, in real time, with no room for error. It worked. It genuinely, remarkably worked. Now let's actually sit with the what if. What if that improvised carbon dioxide fix hadn't worked? What if the engineers on the ground, working under crushing time pressure, had gotten one measurement wrong? I find this detail genuinely hard to shake. The astronauts' survival came down, in part, to duct tape and cardboard, assembled by hand, hundreds of thousands of miles from any possibility of rescue. Consider what a failed mission would have actually meant. 3 American astronauts, stranded and dying in space, broadcast in real time to a watching world. NASA's entire crewed spaceflight program would almost certainly have faced immediate, severe political and public backlash. Some historians argue the remaining Apollo missions, several of which were already facing budget cuts, might have been canceled outright. The moon landings could have ended not with Apollo 17 in 1972, but abruptly, in tragedy, years earlier. And the ripple effects extend further still. Much of the technology developed through the Apollo program, from advances in computing and materials science to medical monitoring devices, fed directly into decades of subsequent innovation. A program halted in disgrace might have delayed or reshaped multiple unrelated fields entirely. There's also a genuinely strange psychological ripple worth considering. Apollo 13 is remembered today as NASA's most celebrated failure, a story of ingenuity triumphing under impossible pressure. It's taught in business schools and engineering courses as a case study in crisis management. A failed Apollo 13 wouldn't have offered that same lesson. It would likely be remembered instead as a cautionary tale about the recklessness of crewed space exploration, a very different legacy entirely. The astronauts themselves later described unexpected calm during parts of the crisis, a strange focus that took over once panic became genuinely useless. Lovell has said in interviews that once the situation was fully understood, the only path forward was simply solving one problem at a time, in order, without stopping to consider the odds. That specific mindset, methodically solving the next solvable problem rather than absorbing the full weight of the danger, is often cited by crisis psychologists as exactly what separates survivable disasters from unsurvivable ones. So here's the thought worth sitting with. Success and failure in this story were separated by an almost absurdly thin margin. Duct tape, cardboard, a carbon dioxide filter built from spare parts under impossible pressure. Sometimes the difference between a celebrated triumph and a devastating tragedy isn't genius. It's just refusing to stop solving the next problem in front of you.